Hey everyone, tonight we begin with something both fascinating and unsettling. The rise of an elite military force that would reshape an empire and terrify Europe for centuries. We're diving deep into the world of the Ottoman Janissaries, those legendary soldier slaves who became the backbone of one of history's most formidable armies. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're 8 years old, playing in the dusty streets of a Serbian village. Your father tends sheep on the hillside. Your mother bakes bread that fills your small home with warmth. Life is simple, predictable, safe. Then one morning, everything changes. Strange men in colourful robes and towering turbans arrive with scrolls and stern faces. They speak in a language you don't understand, but their meaning becomes crystal clear when they point at you, then at your neighbour's son, then at the blacksmith's boy down the lane. Your parents weep. Your mother clutches you tight. But there's nothing they can do. You've been chosen for the Devshirme, the blood tax, and your childhood has just ended forever. This wasn't a rare tragedy. This was systematic. Every few years, Ottoman officials would sweep through Christian villages across the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Caucasus, selecting the brightest, strongest boys between the ages of 8 and 18. They called it recruitment. History calls it something else entirely. These boys would be torn from everything they knew, marched hundreds of miles to the heart of the Ottoman Empire, and transformed into something the world had never seen before. Not quite slaves, not quite free men, but the most feared warriors of their age. The Janissaries weren't just soldiers. They were a contradiction, wrapped in steel and silk. They were Christian boys, turned Muslim warriors, slaves who commanded respect from sultans, celibate men who lived like brothers in barracks that felt more like monasteries than military camps. They were the Ottoman Empire's greatest weapon and, eventually, its most dangerous threat. Tonight, we're going to explore how these remarkable men lived, fought, and died. We'll walk through their brutal training, their strange rituals, their battlefield tactics that made European knights tremble, and the unique culture they created within the walls of their barracks. But to understand the Janissaries, we need to start at the very beginning, with a practice so shocking that it's hard to believe it actually happened. The Devshirme System began in the late 14th century, during the early expansion of the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Murad I realized something that would change the course of history. Traditional feudal armies, with their competing loyalties and personal agendas, were unreliable. Noble warriors fought for themselves, their families, their lands. But what if you could create soldiers who had no loyalty except to the Sultan himself? What if you could take young minds, completely malleable, and forge them into the perfect military instrument? The answer was the Devshirme, and it was both brilliant and horrifying. Every 3 to 7 years, depending on the empire's needs, teams of Ottoman officials would fan out across Christian territories. They carried detailed instructions, almost like a shopping list for human beings. The boys they selected had to meet specific criteria. They couldn't be too young or too old. They had to be physically strong, mentally sharp, and emotionally resilient. Most importantly, they had to be Christian, because Muslim families were exempt from this particular form of taxation. But here's where it gets complicated. While the Devshirme was undoubtedly traumatic for families, it also represented opportunity. These boys, if they survived the system, could rise to heights unimaginable in their birth villages. Some would become palace administrators, governors of provinces, even grand viziers who essentially ran the empire. The most exceptional might catch the eye of the Sultan himself and join the inner circle of power. In a world where your birth determined your destiny, The Devshirme was a brutal but effective form of social mobility. The selection process was thorough and cold. Ottoman recruiters would examine each boy's hands, looking for calluses that might indicate he'd already learned a trade. They checked teeth, posture, reflexes. They asked questions designed to test intelligence and character. Boys who seemed too clever might be destined for the palace school rather than the military. Those who showed particular physical promise would be marked for the Janissary Corps. Imagine being that 8-year-old boy, suddenly thrust into a world where everything familiar disappears. The language, the food, the customs, even the clothes on your back. You're marched alongside dozens of other bewildered children, some crying, some silent with shock, others already trying to make sense of their new reality. The journey to Istanbul could take weeks or months, and many boys wouldn't survive it. Disease, exhaustion, and despair claimed their share. Those who did reach the capital found themselves in yet another selection process. The most promising boys, perhaps 1 in 10, would be sent to the palace school, where they'd receive an education that rivaled anything available in Europe. They'd learn languages, mathematics, literature, statecraft, and military strategy. These were the future administrators of the empire, the ones who would keep the vast Ottoman machine running smoothly. But the majority, the boys deemed suitable for military service, faced a different path entirely. They would become Janissaries, and their real education was about to begin. First, though, they had to be broken down completely, stripped of their former identities and rebuilt as something new. This process was called the Acemi Oglani, or Apprentice Boy System, and it was designed to be transformative on every possible level. The boys were immediately given Turkish names and forbidden from speaking their native languages. They were taught basic Turkish, introduced to Islamic prayers, and gradually converted to Islam. This wasn't just a religious conversion, it was a complete cultural transformation. They learned to see the world through Ottoman eyes, to think of the Sultan not as a foreign conqueror, but as their rightful father and protector. But conversion was just the beginning. The real work of creating Janissaries took place in Anatolia, where the boys were dispersed among Turkish families to learn the language, customs, and agricultural skills. This wasn't just busy work. The Ottomans understood that soldiers needed to understand the people they were defending. A Janissary who had lived among Turkish farmers, who understood their concerns and their way of life, would fight more effectively to protect them. This period lasted anywhere from 5 to 7 years, and it served multiple purposes. The boys learned Turkish fluently, became comfortable with Islamic practices, and developed the physical strength that came from hard agricultural labor. But perhaps most importantly, they formed bonds with their Turkish host families that would last for life. These weren't just soldiers being created. These were Ottoman citizens being forged, men who would see themselves as part of the empire rather than conquered subjects of it. The psychological transformation was remarkable. Boys who had been torn from Christian villages emerged from this process as young men who genuinely believed in the Ottoman system. They weren't bitter slaves dreaming of escape. They were proud members of an elite military order, eager to prove themselves worthy of the honor. The Devshirme system had taken their childhood trauma and transformed it into fierce loyalty. When the boys returned from their agricultural service, usually around the age of 15 or 16, they faced another selection process. The most promising would join the Janissary Novice Corps, where their real military training would begin. This wasn't the kind of basic training that modern armies might recognize. This was something far more intensive, more comprehensive, and more brutal. The novice Janissaries lived in barracks that were part military base, part religious school, part workshop. They learned to read and write, studied Islamic law and history, and mastered various crafts and trades. A Janissary wasn't just a soldier, he was expected to be a complete man, capable of serving the empire in whatever capacity was needed. Some specialized in engineering, others in medicine, still others in logistics and supply. But the heart of their education was military. They learned to use every weapon in the Ottoman arsenal: swords, spears, bows, and increasingly, firearms. The Ottomans were early adopters of gunpowder weapons, and the Janissaries became perhaps the first truly effective infantry force built around firearms. While European armies were still figuring out how to integrate arquebuses and muskets with traditional weapons, the Janissaries were already masters of combined arms tactics. Their training was relentless. Dawn would bring prayers, followed by weapons practice, physical conditioning, and tactical exercises. Afternoons might be devoted to crafts or academic study. Evenings were for more prayers, communal meals, and the kind of bonding that turned individuals into a cohesive fighting force. This wasn't just military training, it was social engineering on a massive scale. The Janissaries developed their own unique culture, one that blended military discipline with religious devotion and fraternal bonds. They lived together, ate together, prayed together, and fought together. Their loyalty wasn't just to the Sultan or the Empire, it was to each other. This brotherhood would become both their greatest strength and, eventually, their most dangerous weakness. The barracks where they lived were unlike anything else in the Ottoman world. Part fortress, part monastery, part workshop. They were designed to create a specific type of man. High walls kept the outside world at bay. Strict schedules regulated every moment of the day, and elaborate rituals reinforced the bonds between the men and their shared identity as Janissaries. Their daily life was governed by rules that seemed almost monastic. They were forbidden to marry until they retired from active service. They couldn't own property or engage in trade. Their loyalty had to be absolute and undivided. In return, they received regular pay, something almost unheard of in medieval armies, excellent food, medical care, and the respect that came with membership in an elite military order. The food was particularly important. While most soldiers of the era survived on whatever they could forage or steal, the Janissaries ate well. Their daily rations included meat, rice, bread, and vegetables. They even received coffee, a luxury that was just beginning to spread through the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't just about nutrition, though that was important. Good food was a symbol of the Sultan's care for his soldiers, a daily reminder that they were valued and respected. Their weapons and equipment were equally impressive. Each Janissary received a standard issue uniform, typically blue or white, with the distinctive felt cap that became their trademark. Their weapons were maintained by imperial armories and replaced when necessary. This standardization was revolutionary for its time. While European armies were still a patchwork of different equipment and fighting styles, the Janissaries presented a uniform, disciplined appearance that was both practical and psychologically intimidating. But it was their discipline that truly set them apart. European observers were amazed by their order and precision. They moved in formation, responded to commands instantly, and maintained their ranks even under the heaviest fire. This wasn't just the result of training, though training was crucial. It was the product of a lifetime of conditioning, of men who had been shaped from childhood to think and act as part of a greater whole. Their battlefield tactics reflected this discipline and training. The Janissaries fought primarily as infantry, using firearms supported by traditional weapons. They would advance in tight formations, deliver devastating volleys of musket fire, then close with sword and spear if necessary. Their artillery support was equally impressive. Ottoman cannons, many of them operated by Janissary specialists, could breach the strongest fortifications. But perhaps their most effective weapon was psychological. The sight of Janissary formations advancing across a battlefield, their ranks perfectly aligned, their weapons gleaming, their battle cries echoing across the field, was enough to break the morale of many opposing armies. They had a reputation for being unstoppable, and in the early centuries of their existence, that reputation was largely deserved. The The Janissaries weren't just effective in large battles. They were equally formidable in sieges, raids, and garrison duty. Their engineering skills allowed them to construct and operate complex siege equipment. Their discipline made them reliable defenders of key fortresses, and their loyalty made them perfect for the kind of sensitive missions that required absolute trust. As we settle deeper into their world, we begin to see how these remarkable men lived when they weren't fighting. Tomorrow, we'll explore the intricate social structure of the Janissary Corps, their strange rituals and traditions, and the unique brotherhood that bound them together. We'll discover how they spent their days in peacetime, what they did for entertainment, and how they dealt with the psychological challenges of a life dedicated entirely to warfare and service. The daily rhythm of Janissary life was unlike anything else in the medieval world. While European soldiers might spend months idle between campaigns, drinking away their pay in taverns and causing trouble in towns, the Janissaries lived according to a schedule that would make modern military officers proud. Their day began before dawn, with the call to prayer echoing through the stone corridors of their barracks like a gentle but insistent bell. Picture these men, hundreds of them in a single compound, rising as one from their simple beds. No individual rooms, no privacy in the modern sense. They slept in long dormitories, each man allocated just enough space for a sleeping mat, a small chest for personal belongings, and perhaps a prayer rug. The walls were bare stone, practical rather than decorative, though some barracks featured beautiful calligraphy from the Quran carved into the archways and doorframes. After morning prayers came the first meal of the day, and here we see something revolutionary. While most armies of the time survived on whatever scraps they could find, the Janissaries ate from a communal kitchen that operated like clockwork. Enormous copper cauldrons, some so large a man could climb inside them, would simmer with rice pilaf, lamb stew, or lentil soup. Fresh bread, baked daily in the barracks ovens, was distributed according to strict protocols. Each man knew exactly what his share would be, and woe to anyone who tried to take more than his due. The kitchen staff weren't just cooks. They were part of the military hierarchy. The head cook, known as the Ashchai Bashi, held a rank equivalent to a company commander. Under him worked dozens of assistants, each with specific responsibilities. Some tended the fires, others prepared ingredients, still others served the meals with ceremonial precision. The great cauldrons themselves became symbols of Janissary identity, almost sacred objects that represented the unity and sustenance of the corps. These cauldrons played a central role in Janissary culture in ways that might seem strange to modern minds. When a unit was particularly unhappy with their commanders or their conditions, they might overturn their cauldrons in protest. This wasn't just wasting food. It was a symbolic act that carried enormous weight. An overturned cauldron meant the natural order of the barracks had been disrupted, that the sacred bond between the Sultan and his soldiers was in danger. Such protests were taken very seriously by Ottoman authorities, often leading to immediate investigations and reforms. After the morning meal came the heart of their daily routine, training and duty. But this wasn't the mindless drill that characterized many armies. Janissary training was sophisticated, varied, and designed to create thinking soldiers rather than simple automatons. They practiced with their firearms, of course, learning to load, aim, and fire with mechanical precision. But they also studied tactics, learned to read terrain, and practiced the complex maneuvers that made them so effective on the battlefield. Their marksmanship training was legendary. European visitors to Ottoman territories often wrote with amazement about Janissary accuracy with their muskets. They could hit targets at distances that seemed impossible to armies still struggling with the basics of gunpowder weapons. This skill came from daily practice, but also from an understanding of their weapons that went beyond mere use. Many Janissaries learned to maintain and even manufacture their own firearms, giving them an intimate knowledge of how the weapons worked and what they were capable of. Physical conditioning was equally important. The Janissaries practiced wrestling, a sport that was deeply embedded in Turkish culture. They ran long distances, carrying full equipment. They practiced climbing walls, swimming rivers, and moving silently through difficult terrain. This wasn't just about building strength. It was about building the kind of endurance and resilience that would serve them in the grueling campaigns that defined Ottoman expansion. But perhaps most importantly, they practiced working together. Janissary formations were incredibly complex, requiring each man to know not just his own role, but how that role fit into the larger tactical picture. They practiced advancing under fire, maintaining formation while maneuvering around obstacles, and the delicate coordination required to reload and fire in sequence. A Janissary unit could deliver continuous volleys of musket fire, with one rank firing while another reloaded, creating a sustained barrage that could break the strongest cavalry charge. Their weapons training extended beyond firearms. Every Janissary was proficient with the yataghan, a distinctive curved sword that became as much a symbol of their corps as their felt caps. They learned to use spears, axes, and bows, understanding that battles were unpredictable, and a warrior might need any weapon that came to hand. Some specialized in particular weapons, becoming masters of the crossbow or experts with the warhammer. The afternoon hours might be devoted to other skills that made the Janissaries more than just soldiers. Some learned engineering, studying the principles of fortification and siege warfare. They learned to build bridges, construct artillery emplacements, and undermine enemy walls. Others focused on medicine, becoming field surgeons who could treat wounds and diseases that might otherwise cripple an army. Still others studied languages, becoming interpreters and intelligence gatherers who could operate behind enemy lines. This diversity of skills was deliberate. The Ottoman Empire was vast and complex, and the Janissaries needed to be able to serve in any capacity required. A Janissary company might find itself garrison duty in a remote fortress, conducting diplomatic missions in hostile territory, or serving as engineers during a siege. Their training prepared them for all these roles and more. The barracks themselves were designed to foster this kind of versatility and brotherhood. Beyond the sleeping quarters and kitchens were workshops where Janissaries could practice crafts during their off hours. Some became skilled metalworkers, creating weapons and armor. Others learned carpentry, masonry, or textile work. These skills served practical purposes, allowing the corps to maintain and repair their own equipment, but they also provided a sense of accomplishment and identity beyond pure military service. The hierarchy within the barracks was complex but clear. New recruits, fresh from their rural training, started at the bottom as apprentices. They served the veteran Janissaries, maintained equipment, and gradually learned the unwritten rules that governed barracks life. Promotion came through demonstrated skill, courage, and loyalty, but also through the subtle politics that exist in any closed community. The veterans, men who had survived multiple campaigns and proven themselves in battle, commanded enormous respect. They were the keepers of tradition, the ones who passed down the stories, techniques, and cultural practices that made the Janissaries unique. A young recruit might spend years learning not just from formal instruction, but from the casual conversations and shared experiences of these grizzled warriors. But even among the veterans, there were distinctions. Some had earned special recognition for acts of bravery or skill. Others had been selected for specialized roles that carried additional prestige. The most senior might serve as advisors to the officers, helping to plan campaigns or evaluate new recruits. This wasn't a simple military hierarchy. It was a complex social structure that recognized multiple forms of achievement and contribution. The officers themselves were usually former Janissaries who had risen through the ranks, though some came from the palace school system. They lived in slightly better quarters, ate at separate tables, and enjoyed certain privileges, but they remained part of the same brotherhood. A Janissary officer who became too distant from his men, who forgot his origins or failed to maintain the respect of the ranks, might find himself facing an overturned cauldron and a very uncomfortable conversation with his superiors. This social structure extended beyond the barracks walls. In the cities where they were stationed, Janissaries often formed connections with local craftsmen, merchants, and religious figures. They might patronize particular shops, attend specific mosques, or develop friendships that lasted decades. These connections served practical purposes, providing intelligence and support during campaigns, but they also helped integrate the Janissaries into the broader fabric of Ottoman society. The religious life of the Janissaries was central to their identity, but different from what might be expected. They were Muslims, certainly, and observed the daily prayers and other obligations of their faith. But their Islam was shaped by their unique circumstances and history. Many had been born Christians, and while they converted sincerely, they brought with them cultural memories and perspectives that created a distinctive religious culture within the core. Their mosques, often built within or adjacent to their barracks, reflected this unique identity. The architecture might follow traditional Islamic patterns, but the decorations and inscriptions often emphasized themes of brotherhood, loyalty, and service that spoke directly to the Janissary experience. The Friday prayers became not just religious observances, but community gatherings where the bonds of the core were reinforced and renewed. Some Janissaries developed deep scholarly interests in Islamic law and theology. They might spend their free time copying religious texts, composing prayers, or engaging in theological discussions with their comrades. Others found their spiritual expression in the mystical traditions of Sufism, with its emphasis on direct personal experience of the divine. These mystical practices, with their music, poetry, and ecstatic rituals, provided an emotional outlet that complemented the disciplined structure of military life. The tension between their military duties and their spiritual aspirations created a unique psychological profile. They were warriors who spent significant time in contemplation and prayer. They were men of violence who also valued scholarship and artistic expression. This complexity made them more than simple soldiers. It made them a kind of warrior-monk class that had few parallels in European military traditions. Their leisure time, when they had it, reflected these multiple interests and identities. Some Janissaries became skilled musicians, playing the traditional instruments of Turkish folk music during evening gatherings. Others told stories, keeping alive both the official histories of their campaigns and the unofficial legends that grew up around particular heroes or battles. Still others engaged in poetry, often composing verses that celebrated their brotherhood or mourned fallen comrades. Games and sports provided another outlet for their competitive spirits. Wrestling remained popular, with regular tournaments that could draw spectators from across the city. They played various board games, some of which required strategic thinking that complemented their military training. Archery contests, even as firearms became their primary weapons, maintained connections to older military traditions and provided opportunities for individual achievement. But perhaps their most distinctive leisure activity was the coffeehouse culture that developed around many Janissary barracks. Coffee had recently arrived in the Ottoman Empire from Yemen, and the Janissaries became some of its most enthusiastic adopters. Coffee houses near the barracks became informal social centres where Janissaries could relax, discuss current events, and maintain connections with the civilian world beyond their military duties. These coffee houses weren't just places of entertainment. They became centres of information and sometimes political discussion. Janissaries might learn about developments in distant provinces, hear rumours about upcoming campaigns, or discuss the policies of their commanders. The coffeehouse culture gave them a space to be something other than soldiers, to engage with ideas and conversations that went beyond their immediate military concerns. As night fell over the barracks, the Janissaries would return to their dormitories for evening prayers and sleep. But even in sleep, they remained soldiers. Guards were posted, weapons were kept ready, and the entire compound maintained the alertness that came from knowing that war might call at any moment. Tomorrow might bring news of a campaign, orders to march, or the arrival of new recruits who would need to be integrated into this remarkable brotherhood. The life they had built was artificial in many ways, created by imperial decree and maintained by military discipline. But it was also genuine, forged by shared experiences and common purpose. These men had been taken from their families as children, but they had created a new family among themselves. They had lost their birth identities, but they had gained something that many would argue was more valuable: a place in history as members of one of the most effective military forces the world had ever seen. The weapons that made the Janissaries legendary weren't just tools of war. They were extensions of their very souls, crafted with a precision that European armies could barely comprehend. While other soldiers might carry whatever blade they could afford or inherit, every Janissary received weapons that were standardized, maintained, and blessed by the Empire's finest craftsmen. Their primary firearm was the tufek, an early musket that evolved considerably over the centuries. In the early days of the corps, these were simple arquebuses, heavy and unreliable weapons that required careful handling and considerable skill to use effectively. But the Ottomans were quick to recognize the potential of gunpowder weapons, and they invested heavily in improving both the weapons themselves and the training of the men who wielded them. By the 16th century, Janissary muskets were among the finest in the world. They were lighter than their European counterparts, more accurate, and designed for the specific tactical needs of Ottoman warfare. The barrels were crafted by master smiths in Istanbul, men whose families had been perfecting their art for generations. Each weapon was tested, calibrated, and marked with the seal of its maker before being issued to a Janissary. But the musket was just one part of their arsenal. Every Janissary also carried a yataghan, the distinctive curved sword that became as much a symbol of their identity as their uniforms. These weren't crude chopping implements. They were works of art, with blades that could slice through mail and hilts decorated with silver inlay and precious stones. The curve of the blade wasn't just aesthetic, it was functional, designed to deliver devastating cuts that could disable an opponent with a single stroke. The crafting of a yataghan was a ritual in itself. The blade began as raw steel, heated in forges that burned day and night in the weapon districts of Istanbul. Master smiths would fold and refold the metal, creating patterns in the steel that were both beautiful and functional. The edge would be hardened to razor sharpness, while the spine remained flexible enough to absorb the shock of combat. The finished blade would ring like a bell when struck, a sound that experienced warriors could use to judge its quality. Each Janissary learned not just to use his yataghan, but to maintain it. They understood the steel, knew how to sharpen the edge without damaging the temper, and could perform field repairs that might mean the difference between life and death in battle. Some became so skilled at weapon maintenance that they served as unofficial armorers for their units, keeping dozens of blades in perfect condition. Beyond their personal weapons, the Janissaries operated artillery that was the envy of Europe. Ottoman cannons, many of them cast in the foundries of Istanbul by Hungarian and Italian engineers who had entered Ottoman service, could breach walls that had stood for centuries. The famous siege of Constantinople in 1453 had showcased Ottoman artillery to the world, and the Janissaries became the masters of these terrible engines of war. Operating cannons required skills that went far beyond simply lighting a fuse. Janissary gunners learned mathematics to calculate trajectories, engineering to position their weapons effectively, and chemistry to create the various types of shot that different situations required. They could fire solid stone balls to breach walls, explosive shells to create panic among defenders, or loads of smaller projectiles to sweep enemy formations from the field. The largest cannons required teams of men to operate effectively. Loading a gun that fired balls weighing several hundred pounds was a complex choreography that demanded perfect timing and coordination. One mistake could result in the gun exploding, killing everyone nearby. The The Janissary gunners developed elaborate rituals around the loading and firing of their weapons, part practical procedure and part spiritual preparation for the moment when they would unleash destruction upon their enemies. But artillery was just one aspect of their technical expertise. Janissary engineers became legendary for their ability to conduct sieges. They could build the complex earthworks needed to approach enemy fortifications, construct the wooden towers and bridges required for assaults, and undermine walls with tunnels and explosives. These weren't crude sapping operations. They were sophisticated engineering projects that required knowledge of soil conditions, structural engineering, and explosive chemistry. The tools of siege warfare were as carefully crafted as their personal weapons. Scaling ladders were built to precise specifications, light enough for men to carry, but strong enough to bear the weight of fully armed warriors. Siege towers were mobile fortresses, equipped with drawbridges, arrow loops, and platforms for archers and musketeers. Some of these towers stood over 100 feet tall, requiring careful engineering to remain stable while being rolled across uneven ground under enemy fire. Mining operations required different tools and skills entirely. Janissary miners worked with picks and shovels specifically designed for different types of soil and stone. They used timber supports that could be quickly installed and just as quickly burned away when the time came to collapse a tunnel. They learned to work in complete darkness, navigating by touch and hearing through underground passages that might extend for hundreds of yards. The explosives they used were carefully prepared mixtures of gunpowder, often enhanced with other materials to increase their destructive power. The timing of these explosions required precise calculation, too early, and the assault troops wouldn't be in position to exploit the breach. Too late, and the defenders might have time to prepare countermeasures. Janissary engineers developed elaborate timing systems, sometimes using slow-burning fuses that could be calibrated to the minute. Their defensive capabilities were equally impressive. When tasked with holding a fortress or fortified position, the Janissaries could transform almost any structure into a formidable stronghold. They understood the principles of overlapping fields of fire, could quickly construct earthworks and palisades, and knew how to position their weapons for maximum effectiveness. They were masters of the crossfire, setting up their muskets so that attackers would face fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Their artillery would be positioned to cover the most likely approaches, with carefully prepared charges ready to destroy bridges or gates if the position became untenable. They even learned to use the terrain itself as a weapon, channeling attackers into killing zones, where concentrated fire could devastate entire formations. The psychological aspect of their weaponry was just as important as its physical capabilities. The sight of Janissary artillery being wheeled into position was often enough to convince defenders to surrender rather than face a siege. The sound of their drums and the display of their banners announced their presence on the battlefield like a thunderclap. They cultivated an image of invincibility that often proved more valuable than their actual weapons. Their uniforms and equipment were designed to enhance this psychological impact. The famous Janissary cap, with its distinctive white felt and hanging flap, was instantly recognizable across Europe and Asia. Their robes, typically blue or white, were cut in a style that was both practical and imposing. When hundreds of these identically dressed warriors advanced across a battlefield in perfect formation, the effect on enemy morale was devastating. But the Janissaries understood that battles weren't won by intimidation alone. Their tactical doctrine was sophisticated, flexible, and constantly evolving to meet new challenges. Unlike European armies that often relied on single massive charges or prolonged archery duels, the Janissaries fought with a combined arms approach that integrated infantry, artillery, and cavalry into a seamless whole. Their basic formation was the wagon fort, a defensive arrangement of wagons, artillery, and infantry that could move across the battlefield like a mobile fortress. The wagons provided cover for the infantry and a stable platform for the artillery. Chains could be stretched between the wagons to create additional obstacles for enemy cavalry. The entire formation could advance, retreat, or change direction while maintaining its defensive integrity. Within this formation, the Janissaries operated with a discipline that amazed their enemies. They could fire by ranks, delivering continuous volleys while maintaining their positions. They could rapidly redeploy their artillery to meet threats from different directions. Most importantly, they could coordinate their movements with the Ottoman cavalry, creating combined attacks that few armies of the period could withstand. Their siege tactics were equally sophisticated. Rather than simply surrounding a city and waiting for starvation to do its work, the Janissaries would systematically reduce the defenses through a combination of artillery bombardment, mining operations, and carefully coordinated assaults. They would study the fortifications for weeks, identifying weak points and developing specific plans for each section of wall or each defensive tower. The assault itself would be a precisely timed operation involving multiple elements. Artillery would concentrate on breaching the walls, while diversionary attacks drew defenders away from the main point of assault. Engineers would explode mines to bring down towers or create gaps in the defenses. Infantry would storm through the breaches, while other units sealed off potential escape routes or prevented reinforcement of the threatened sector. But perhaps their most impressive capability was their adaptability. The Janissaries fought effectively in the mountains of the Caucasus, the deserts of Syria, the forests of Hungary, and the plains of Anatolia. They adapted their tactics, equipment, and even their uniforms to meet the specific challenges of each environment. A Janissary unit operating in the winter campaigns against Poland might look quite different from one serving in the summer heat of an Arabian expedition. This adaptability extended to their weapons as well. In forested terrain, they might carry shorter muskets that were easier to maneuver among the trees. In desert campaigns, they would modify their equipment to deal with sand and heat. Mountain warfare called for specialized climbing equipment and tactics adapted to fighting on steep slopes and narrow paths. Their intelligence gathering was another crucial aspect of their effectiveness. Janissary units often included men who spoke local languages and understood regional customs. These soldiers could operate behind enemy lines, gathering information about fortifications, troop movements, and supply lines. Some became so skilled at this work that they operated as long-term agents, living for months or even years in enemy territory while sending back valuable intelligence. The information they gathered wasn't just tactical. They reported on political conditions, economic resources, and social tensions that might be exploited during a campaign. A Janissary intelligence report might include details about harvest conditions that would affect food supplies, religious conflicts that could be used to turn populations against their rulers, or merchant networks that could be disrupted to damage enemy logistics. This intelligence network was one of the reasons Ottoman campaigns were so often successful. While their enemies fought blind, relying on outdated information and rumor, the Ottomans advanced with detailed knowledge of what lay ahead. They knew where the good water sources were, which roads were passable for their artillery, and where they might expect to find allies or resistance among the local population. The training required to create such versatile and effective soldiers was intensive and never-ending. Even veteran Janissaries continued to learn new skills and refine old ones throughout their careers. They studied the weapons and tactics of their enemies, incorporating useful innovations while maintaining their own distinctive methods. They practiced constantly, both individually and as units, ensuring that their skills remained sharp even during long periods of peace. Young Janissaries learned not just from formal instruction, but from the accumulated wisdom of their older comrades. Veterans would share stories of particular battles or sieges, highlighting the lessons learned and the mistakes to avoid. These stories became part of the oral tradition of the corps, passed down through generations and serving as both entertainment and education during long winter nights in the barracks. The weapons training was particularly intensive. A new Janissary might spend months learning to load and fire his musket before he was allowed to practice with live ammunition. Even then, he would fire thousands of rounds under supervision before being considered competent. Marksmanship was tested regularly, with competitions that determined not just individual skill, but also unit readiness for combat. Swordwork required different skills entirely. The yataghan was not a European sword, and European techniques were useless with it. Janissaries learned to use the curved blade's unique properties, delivering cuts that used the weapon's design to maximum advantage. They practiced against multiple opponents, learning to move and strike in the confused melee of close combat. They even learned to fight left-handed, understanding that wounds or circumstances might force them to adapt their techniques in the midst of battle. Physical conditioning was equally demanding. Janissaries were expected to march long distances in full equipment, fight effectively after days without sleep, and maintain their strength and endurance throughout campaigns that might last for months. They practiced swimming in armor, climbing walls under fire, and carrying wounded comrades while still maintaining their defensive capabilities. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to function as part of a unit. Individual heroics might win praise, but battles were won by disciplined formations acting in coordination. They practiced the complex maneuvers that allowed hundreds of men to move and fight as a single entity. They learned the signals and commands that could redirect their efforts in the middle of a battle. Most crucially, they learned to trust the men beside them with their lives. This trust wasn't just professional, it was personal, forged through shared hardships and common purpose. These men lived together, fought together, and often died together. The bonds they formed were stronger than family ties, deeper than friendship. They were brothers in the truest sense, united by experiences that few outside their ranks could understand or share. As the sun set over the sprawling Ottoman Empire, the transformation was complete. Boys who had once herded goats in Serbian villages now stood guard over the gates of Istanbul. Children who had spoken only their native tongues now conversed fluently in Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. The Devshirme had worked its strange alchemy, turning Christian peasants into the most feared Muslim warriors of their age. But the real magic wasn't in the conversion or the training. It was in what happened next, in the daily rhythms and rituals that would define their entire adult lives. Because being a Janissary wasn't just a job. It was a complete identity, a way of existing that had no parallel in the medieval world. The barracks where they lived were cities unto themselves, sprawling complexes that housed thousands of men in a carefully orchestrated society. Imagine walking through the gates of a major Janissary compound in 16th century Istanbul. The first thing that would strike you wouldn't be the martial atmosphere you might expect. It would be the sounds and smells of a thriving community. From the workshops came the ring of hammers on metal as Janissaries crafted and repaired weapons. The air carried the aroma of bread baking in massive ovens, the scent of coffee brewing in copper pots, and the subtle perfume of incense from the compound's mosque. Children's laughter echoed from the quarters where married veterans lived with their families, mixing with the deeper voices of men engaged in animated discussions about theology, politics, or the merits of different fighting techniques. This wasn't a grim military installation. It was a living, breathing world where warriors had created something unprecedented. A society of soldier monks who had found ways to balance the demands of war with the human need for community, learning, and spiritual fulfillment. The daily schedule that governed their lives was as precise as the movements of a well-crafted clockwork. Before dawn, the call to prayer would echo through stone corridors, pulling men from their beds with a sound that had become as natural to them as breathing. But these weren't the reluctant stirrings of conscripted soldiers dragged from comfortable homes. These men rose eagerly, understanding that each day brought them closer to perfection in their chosen path. Prayer wasn't just religious obligation, it was community building, a moment when hundreds of men would kneel in unison, their individual voices joining in recitations that bound them together more surely than any military oath. The mosque at the heart of every major Janissary compound wasn't just a place of worship. It was the spiritual center of their universe, where they connected not only with Allah, but with each other, and with the long tradition of warriors who had knelt on these same stones before them. After morning prayers came the ritual that perhaps more than any other defined Janissary culture, the distribution of food from the great communal kitchens. But this wasn't simply about nutrition, though the food was far better than what most soldiers of the era could expect. This was about identity, hierarchy, and belonging. The kitchens themselves were marvels of organization and efficiency. Enormous hearths could accommodate cooking pots large enough for a man to stand inside. Teams of cooks, many of them Janissaries who had developed culinary skills alongside their martial ones, prepared meals that fed thousands while maintaining consistent quality and flavor. The head cook wasn't just a food service manager. He was a figure of genuine authority, responsible for maintaining the morale and health of the entire unit. The serving of meals followed protocols as rigid as any military ceremony. Men lined up according to their rank and seniority, but also according to more subtle hierarchies based on reputation, skill, and the respect of their comrades. The newest recruits served their elders, learning through this daily ritual the importance of humility and service that would guide them throughout their careers. But the food itself told a story of Ottoman wealth and sophistication. While European soldiers might survive on black bread and watery beer, the Janissaries dined on rice pilaf fragrant with saffron, lamb stews seasoned with exotic spices, fresh vegetables from the empire's fertile provinces, and sweets that would have graced the table of any European noble. This wasn't extravagance, it was investment, recognition that well-fed soldiers fought more effectively and remained loyal longer. The famous coffee that became associated with Janissary culture wasn't just a beverage, it was a social institution. Coffee houses near the barracks became informal centers of power, where veterans would gather to discuss everything from military tactics to imperial politics. Young Janissaries would listen carefully to these conversations, learning not just about warfare, but about the complex web of relationships and interests that held the empire together. These coffeehouse gatherings were where much of the real education took place. Formal training could teach a man to load and fire a musket, but it took years of conversation with experienced warriors to understand when to fire, where to aim, and how to read the subtle signs that indicated whether an enemy formation was about to break or rally. The coffeehouses were universities of practical warfare, where knowledge passed from generation to generation through stories, debates, and shared experience. The hierarchy within Janissary society was both rigid and fluid, creating a system that rewarded merit while maintaining discipline. New recruits entered at the bottom of a complex ladder that stretched from apprentice soldiers to the highest officers of the corps. But unlike European military systems based on birth and wealth, Janissary rank was earned through demonstrated skill, courage, and leadership. A young man might begin his career serving veterans, maintaining their equipment, and learning through observation and imitation. Those who showed promise would gradually be given more responsibility, perhaps leading small patrols or training newer recruits. The most exceptional might catch the attention of senior officers and find themselves selected for specialized training in engineering, artillery, or intelligence work. But advancement wasn't just about individual achievement. The Janissaries valued collective success over personal glory. A man who fought brilliantly but failed to support his comrades might find his career stalled, while one who consistently contributed to unit effectiveness could rise rapidly through the ranks. This emphasis on teamwork created a military culture that was remarkably effective but also remarkably cohesive. The training that continued throughout a Janissary's career went far beyond basic military skills. These men were expected to be capable of serving the empire in whatever capacity was required. Some became diplomats, using their knowledge of languages and foreign cultures to negotiate with enemy powers. Others specialized in logistics, managing the complex supply chains that kept Ottoman armies fed and equipped during long campaigns. Many developed expertise in various crafts and trades. A Janissary unit might include skilled metalworkers who could repair weapons and armor, carpenters who could construct siege equipment, and even physicians who could treat battlefield wounds. This diversity of skills made Janissary units remarkably self-sufficient, able to operate independently for extended periods without requiring support from civilian specialists. The intellectual life of the corps was equally impressive. Many Janissaries became accomplished scholars, studying Islamic law, history, and theology. They copied manuscripts, composed poetry, and engaged in theological debates that would have impressed the scholars of any European university. Some wrote memoirs and military treatises that provide invaluable insights into Ottoman military practice and the mindset of these remarkable warriors. Their libraries, housed within the barracks complexes, contained works in multiple languages and covered subjects ranging from military engineering to mystical philosophy. Reading wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. A Janissary who couldn't read was considered incomplete, unable to fully participate in the intellectual life of the corps, or to study the religious texts that were central to their identity as Muslim warriors. But perhaps most remarkably, many Janissaries became accomplished artists and musicians. The military bands that accompanied Ottoman armies weren't just for morale and communication, though they served those purposes admirably. They were expressions of the cultural sophistication that the Janissaries had developed within their martial brotherhood. The music they created was unlike anything heard in European armies. Complex rhythms played on drums of various sizes, haunting melodies from reed instruments, and the clash of cymbals that could be heard for miles across a battlefield. This music served practical purposes, coordinating movements and signaling commands, but it also expressed something deeper about Janissary identity and culture. And when European prisoners of war wrote about their captivity among the Ottomans, they often expressed amazement at the cultural life they witnessed in Janissary camps. These weren't barbarian hordes, as Christian propaganda often portrayed them. They were cultured, educated men who combined martial prowess with genuine intellectual and artistic achievement. Their poetry, much of it preserved in Ottoman archives, reveals the complex inner lives of these warrior scholars. They wrote about the brotherhood they shared, the beauty of the lands they had conquered, the pain of separation from families they barely remembered, and the spiritual struggles of men who had dedicated their lives to warfare in service of their faith. The religious life of the Janissaries was particularly complex, shaped by their unique origins and circumstances. They were Muslims, certainly, but their Islam was different from that of men born into the faith. They brought to their religious practice a sense of conscious choice and commitment that came from having experienced conversion. Many became more devout than those who had never known any other religion. Their mosques reflected this distinctive spiritual culture. The prayers offered there weren't just the standard Islamic liturgy, though that was certainly included. They were also prayers specific to the needs and concerns of warriors, asking for courage in battle, protection for comrades, and guidance in the complex moral decisions that military life demanded. Some Janissaries became deeply involved in Sufi mysticism, finding in its emphasis on direct spiritual experience a counterbalance to the harsh realities of their military duties. Sufi lodges associated with various Janissary units became centers of spiritual practice, where men could explore questions of meaning and purpose that went beyond mere military effectiveness. The tension between their warrior identity and their spiritual aspirations created a unique psychological profile. They were men of violence who spent significant time in prayer and contemplation. They were killers who also valued scholarship and artistic expression. This complexity made them more than simple soldiers. It made them a distinctive type of human being, shaped by experiences and expectations that had no parallel in the medieval world. Their relationship with death was particularly complex. As professional soldiers, they lived daily with the reality that their next battle might be their last. But as deeply religious men, they also believed that death in service of Islam guaranteed immediate entry into paradise. This combination of fatalistic acceptance and spiritual confidence made them remarkably effective warriors, but also gave them a philosophical depth that impressed even their enemies. When Janissaries died in battle, their comrades didn't just mourn the loss of skilled fighters. They celebrated the martyrdom of brothers who had achieved the ultimate goal of their faith. The funerals of fallen Janissaries became community events that reinforced the bonds between the living while honoring the sacrifice of the dead. But death in battle wasn't the only end that awaited these remarkable men. Many Janissaries lived long enough to retire from active service, at which point they faced the challenge of adapting to civilian life after decades in the military brotherhood. Some remained associated with their units as advisors or instructors. Others used their skills and connections to establish themselves in trade or crafts. The most successful might be appointed to administrative positions within the imperial government, using their knowledge of military affairs and their reputation for loyalty to serve the empire in new ways. Some became governors of provinces, judges in Islamic courts, or diplomatic representatives to foreign powers. But retirement also meant the end of the brotherhood that had defined their entire adult lives. Men who had lived surrounded by hundreds of comrades suddenly found themselves alone with their thoughts and memories. Some adapted successfully to this transition, building new relationships and finding fulfillment in family life and civilian pursuits. Others struggled with the loss of purpose and community that had given their lives meaning. The Janissaries who married after retirement often had difficulty relating to wives and children who couldn't understand the experiences that had shaped them. They had lived through things that couldn't be easily explained to civilians, had formed bonds that couldn't be replicated outside the military brotherhood. Some found themselves returning again and again to their old barracks, seeking the company of men who shared their memories and understood their struggles. As we delve deeper into their world, we begin to see how the Janissary system created not just effective soldiers, but an entirely new form of human community. Tomorrow night, we'll explore their most legendary battles, the tactics that made them nearly invincible for centuries, and the gradual changes that would eventually lead to their downfall. We'll witness them in action at the gates of Vienna, in the mountain passes of the Caucasus, and on the plains of Hungary, where they carved out an empire that stretched across 3 continents. But tonight, as we imagine these remarkable men settling into their stone dormitories after another day of training and brotherhood, we can appreciate the extraordinary achievement of the Ottoman system. They had taken children from scattered villages and transformed them into something the world had never seen before. Not just soldiers, but scholar warriors, artist fighters, men who combined the highest achievements of medieval civilization with the most effective military machine of their age. The soft murmur of evening prayers echoes through the barracks one last time. Candles flicker out in the workshops where men have been crafting tomorrow's weapons. The great kitchens grow quiet as the last dishes are cleaned and stored. And in the dormitories, hundreds of men who had once been strangers to each other settle into sleep, bound together by shared purpose and mutual loyalty that would carry them through whatever battles awaited them. In the morning, they would rise again to the call of prayer, take their places at the communal tables, and continue the daily ritual of becoming the most feared and respected warriors of their time. But they would do so not as individuals forced into service, but as members of a brotherhood that had given their lives meaning, purpose, and a place in history that would be remembered long after their empire had crumbled into dust. The brotherhood that bound the Janissaries together was tested most severely, not in the quiet moments of barracks life, but in the crucible of actual warfare. When the great bronze cannons of the Ottoman Empire began their thunderous bombardment of enemy fortifications, when the distinctive white caps of the Janissaries appeared on distant hilltops like ghostly harbingers of doom, entire kingdoms would tremble. These weren't just raids or skirmishes. These were campaigns that would redraw the map of the known world. Picture the scene as word arrives at the barracks that the Sultan has declared war. The peaceful rhythms of daily life would shift instantly into the urgent preparations of an army mobilizing for campaign. The great kitchens that had been preparing daily meals would begin producing the hardtack and preserved foods that would sustain thousands of men on the march. Weapons that had been maintained with loving care would be inspected one final time. Edges sharpened to lethal perfection, firing mechanisms tested and retested. But it wasn't just equipment that needed preparation. The men themselves would undergo a transformation that was both physical and psychological. The contemplative scholars who had been copying manuscripts in quiet corners would pack away their books and take up their swords. The craftsmen who had been working metal in the workshops would turn their skills to ensuring that every piece of military equipment was in perfect condition. The mystics who had been lost in Sufi meditation would focus their spiritual energy on the trials ahead. The ritual of departure was as carefully orchestrated as everything else in Janissary life. Units would form up in the great courtyards of their barracks, their uniforms pristine, their weapons gleaming, their faces set with the grim determination of men who understood that some of them would never return. Prayers would be offered for the success of the campaign and for the souls of those who would fall in service to the empire. Families of married veterans would gather to offer their own farewells, knowing that months or even years might pass before they saw their loved ones again. The march itself was a masterpiece of military organization. Ottoman armies moved with a precision that amazed European observers, covering vast distances while maintaining their combat effectiveness. The Janissaries formed the disciplined core of these movements, setting the pace and maintaining the order that kept thousands of men, horses, and supply wagons moving in the same direction toward the same goal. Their route would often take them through territories that had been conquered in previous campaigns, past the ruins of cities that had dared to resist Ottoman power. These weren't just geographic landmarks. They were reminders of what happened to those who stood against the Sultan's will. Young Janissaries would listen as veterans pointed out battlefields where legendary victories had been won, walls where famous breaches had been made, fields where particularly heroic deeds had been performed. But the march was also an opportunity for continued training and bonding. Evening camps became temporary cities where men would practice their skills, share stories, and strengthen the relationships that would prove crucial in battle. Veterans would take aside younger soldiers to offer advice about surviving their first major engagement. Equipment would be checked and rechecked. Tactics would be discussed and refined based on the latest intelligence about enemy dispositions and capabilities. The intelligence gathering that preceded major campaigns was remarkably sophisticated. Janissary agents, often men who spoke local languages and could pass as merchants or pilgrims, would have been operating behind enemy lines for months before the main army began its advance. They would report on the strength of enemy garrisons, the condition of fortifications, the loyalty of local populations, and countless other details that would influence Ottoman strategy. These reports would be studied carefully by Ottoman commanders, who understood that knowledge was often more valuable than additional troops. They would know which gates in an enemy city were weakest, which commanders were most likely to surrender rather than face a siege, which local nobles might be convinced to switch sides if offered the right incentives. When the Ottoman army finally appeared before an enemy stronghold, they would know exactly what they were facing and how best to overcome it. The siege warfare that the Janissaries had perfected was unlike anything their enemies had experienced. European fortifications had been designed to withstand the kind of medieval warfare that relied primarily on ladders, catapults, and starvation. They were not prepared for the systematic, scientific approach that Ottoman engineers brought to the reduction of fortified positions. The first phase of an Ottoman siege involved the careful positioning of artillery. The great bronze cannons that had become symbols of Ottoman power would be wheeled into position with mathematical precision. Janissary engineers would survey the target fortifications, calculating angles and distances with an accuracy that would have impressed Renaissance mathematicians. The placement of each gun was determined not just by its range and power, but by its role in a carefully coordinated bombardment designed to create specific effects. Some cannons would target the walls themselves, seeking to create breaches through which assault troops could pour. Others would focus on defensive towers, trying to collapse structures from which enemy archers might threaten the attackers. Still others would lob explosive shells over the walls, creating panic among defenders and disrupting their ability to coordinate resistance. The psychological effect of this bombardment was often as important as its physical impact. The continuous thunder of Ottoman artillery, day and night for weeks on end, could break the morale of even the most determined defenders. Citizens would huddle in cellars while their city shook around them. Soldiers would desert their posts rather than face the seemingly inevitable destruction. Sometimes cities would surrender before the first breach was made, simply because the inhabitants couldn't endure the psychological pressure of the bombardment. But the Ottomans understood that artillery alone rarely won sieges. While the guns pounded the fortifications, Janissary engineers would be conducting mining operations designed to bring down entire sections of wall. These weren't crude tunnel-digging operations. They were sophisticated engineering projects that required precise knowledge of soil conditions, structural engineering, and explosive chemistry. The miners would work in shifts around the clock, digging tunnels that extended beneath the enemy fortifications. These passages had to be shored up with timber supports to prevent collapse, ventilated to allow the workers to breathe, and carefully concealed to prevent discovery by the defenders. Some tunnels extended for hundreds of yards, requiring weeks of dangerous work in complete darkness. When the tunnels reached their targets, usually directly beneath the foundations of walls or towers, Janissary engineers would pack them with carefully prepared explosive charges. The timing of these explosions required precise calculation. They had to be coordinated with artillery bombardments and assault preparations to maximize their impact. Too early, and the defenders might have time to repair the damage. Too late, and the assault troops might be caught in the blast. The moment when the mines detonated was perhaps the most terrifying experience in medieval warfare. Entire sections of fortification would simply vanish in towering columns of smoke and debris. The sound could be heard for miles, like thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself. Defenders who survived the initial explosion would often be so stunned and demoralized that they offered little resistance to the assault troops who poured through the gaps. But even with artillery and mining operations, Ottoman sieges often required direct assault by infantry. This was where the training and discipline of the Janissaries proved most crucial. Storming a fortified position was perhaps the most dangerous operation in warfare, requiring men to advance across open ground under heavy fire, climb over rubble and debris, and engage in close combat with desperate defenders. The Janissaries approached these assaults with the same systematic precision they brought to everything else. Assault troops would be organized into multiple waves, each with specific objectives. The first wave would secure the breach and establish a foothold inside the fortifications. Subsequent waves would expand the penetration, secure key points like gates or towers, and prevent counterattacks that might drive the attackers back. Supporting these infantry assaults were specialized units that reflected the diversity of skills within the Janissary Corps. Sappers would work to widen breaches or create new ones under fire. Engineers would throw bridges across ditches or moats. Medical personnel would evacuate wounded and provide emergency treatment. Signal specialists would maintain communication between different assault groups and coordinate with artillery support. The close combat that ensued once the Janissaries penetrated enemy fortifications was brutal and decisive. Their training with the yataghan proved its worth in the confined spaces of fortress corridors and courtyards. The curved blade was perfectly suited for the kind of close-quarters fighting that characterized urban warfare. Its design allowed devastating cuts that could disable opponents quickly, while its length gave Janissaries a slight reach advantage over enemies using straight swords. But perhaps more important than their weapons was their discipline. While other armies might dissolve into chaos once they penetrated enemy defenses, with soldiers breaking ranks to loot or pursue individual enemies, the Janissaries maintained their formation and coordination. They advanced methodically, clearing buildings room by room, securing strategic points, and maintaining communication with their commanders. This discipline was crucial because the capture of outer defenses was often just the beginning of urban fighting. Defenders would retreat to inner citadels, strong points within the city that could be held even after the main walls had fallen. Civilians might barricade themselves in houses that became individual fortresses. Fighting could continue for days or weeks even after the initial breakthrough. The Janissaries had developed specific tactics for this kind of warfare. They would advance in small groups, each responsible for clearing a specific area. Specialists would deal with barricaded doors or windows. Others would secure rooftops to prevent defenders from attacking from above. Still others would control intersections and key buildings that dominated surrounding areas. Their knowledge of engineering proved invaluable in these situations. Janissaries could quickly assess the structural weaknesses of buildings, knowing where to place charges to bring down walls, or how to create openings that would allow access without exposing attackers to unnecessary danger. They understood how to use fire as a weapon, creating smoke that would drive defenders from strong positions, or setting blazes that would force evacuation of entire districts. But the Janissaries were more than just destroyers of cities. They were also skilled at preserving what was valuable once resistance had ended. Ottoman policy generally favored incorporating conquered territories into the empire rather than simply plundering them. This meant that important buildings, infrastructure, and population needed to be protected once military objectives had been achieved. Janissary units would quickly establish order in captured cities, preventing the kind of sack that often followed medieval sieges. They would secure warehouses and treasuries, protect religious buildings and hospitals, and ensure that essential services like water supply and food distribution continued to function. This policy wasn't just humanitarian, though humanitarian concerns played a role. It was practical recognition that destroyed cities produced no taxes and devastated populations couldn't contribute to the empire's strength. The integration of conquered territories into the Ottoman system was another area where Janissary skills proved valuable. Many of these warriors spoke multiple languages and understood different cultural traditions. They could serve as intermediaries between Ottoman administrators and local populations, helping to smooth the transition from independent rule to imperial governance. Some Janissaries would remain in conquered territories as garrison commanders or civil administrators, using their military experience to maintain order and their cultural knowledge to govern effectively. Others would move on with the army to new campaigns, but they would carry with them detailed knowledge of the territories they had helped to conquer, information that would prove valuable for future military operations or administrative policies. The naval warfare that became increasingly important as the Ottoman Empire expanded into the Mediterranean presented different challenges that required adaptation of traditional Janissary skills. Fighting at sea demanded new tactics and equipment, but the fundamental disciplines of coordination, marksmanship, and close combat remained relevant. Janissary Marines became specialists in the kind of boarding actions that characterized naval warfare of the period. They would use their firearms to suppress enemy crew members, then close for hand-to-hand combat using their yataghan and other weapons. Their discipline and training gave them significant advantages over sailors who were primarily concerned with navigation and seamanship rather than combat. The galley warfare that dominated the Mediterranean required particularly close cooperation between Janissary fighters and the rowers who powered the vessels. These ships were floating batteries, designed to close with enemy vessels and deliver devastating volleys of cannon fire and small arms. Janissaries provided the disciplined firepower that made these tactics effective, while also serving as boarding parties when the opportunity arose to capture rather than sink enemy ships. Their experience with artillery on land translated well to naval warfare. Janissary gunners could operate ship-mounted cannons with the same precision they brought to siege warfare. They understood how to coordinate their fire with the movements of their own vessel and to predict the movements of enemy ships. Most importantly, they could maintain their effectiveness even under the challenging conditions of combat at sea. The logistics of supporting these far-ranging military operations were staggering in their complexity. Ottoman armies operating hundreds of miles from their bases required enormous quantities of food, ammunition, and equipment. The Janissaries played crucial roles in managing these supply chains, using their organizational skills and technical knowledge to keep the imperial war machine functioning. Supply trains stretching for miles would accompany major campaigns, protected by Janissary guards who understood that losing the army's food and ammunition would be as disastrous as losing a major battle. These weren't just passive escorts. Janissary logistics specialists would plan routes, negotiate with local populations for additional supplies, and manage the complex distribution systems that ensured each unit received what it needed when it needed it. The medical support that accompanied Ottoman armies was remarkably advanced for its time, largely because of Janissary physicians and medics who had developed their skills through years of treating battlefield injuries. They understood field surgery, could treat infectious diseases, and knew how to maintain sanitary conditions in army camps. Their work not only saved lives, but maintained the fighting strength of units that might otherwise have been decimated by disease. The intelligence networks that supported Ottoman military operations often relied heavily on Janissaries who could operate behind enemy lines. These men would pose as merchants, pilgrims, or refugees, gathering information about enemy preparations, local conditions, and potential allies or threats. Some operated as long-term agents, spending months or years in foreign territories while sending back regular reports. This intelligence work required skills that went beyond traditional military training. Janissary agents needed to be accomplished actors, capable of maintaining false identities under scrutiny. They had to understand foreign customs and languages well enough to avoid detection. Most importantly, they had to possess the kind of judgment that would allow them to distinguish between valuable information and routine gossip. The networks they established often outlasted specific military campaigns, providing the Ottoman government with ongoing intelligence about developments in neighboring countries. Some Janissary agents became so skilled at their work that they operated virtually as diplomatic representatives, maintaining relationships with foreign officials while gathering information for their true masters. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Janissary warfare was their ability to adapt to completely different enemies and environments. The tactics that worked against European knights in the plains of Hungary had to be modified for fighting Safavid cavalry in the mountains of Iran. The siege techniques that reduced Christian fortresses required adjustment when applied to the different architectural styles found in Arab territories. This adaptability reflected the intellectual flexibility that characterized the Janissary system. These weren't mindless automatons trained to perform a single type of warfare. They were thinking soldiers who could analyze new situations, identify effective responses, and implement changes quickly and effectively. Their education in multiple languages, cultures, and technical skills provided the foundation for this adaptability. When facing Safavid forces in eastern campaigns, Janissaries learned to deal with the hit-and-run tactics favored by Persian cavalry. They developed new formations that could respond quickly to attacks from multiple directions while maintaining the firepower concentration that was their primary advantage. They learned to use terrain more effectively, positioning themselves to channel enemy movements into killing zones where their disciplined volleys could be most effective. Fighting in mountainous terrain required modifications to their equipment and tactics. The heavy artillery that was so effective in European campaigns might be impossible to transport through narrow mountain passes. Janissaries learned to operate with lighter weapons, while maintaining their tactical advantages through superior discipline and coordination. Desert campaigns presented entirely different challenges. Water became more precious than ammunition. Navigation required new skills and equipment. The extreme temperatures affected both men and weapons in ways that required constant adaptation. Janissary units operating in these environments developed expertise that made them valuable for future campaigns in similar terrain. The winter campaigns that characterized warfare along the northern frontiers required yet another set of adaptations. Equipment had to be modified to function in freezing temperatures. Soldiers needed different clothing and shelter. Supply requirements changed dramatically when armies had to carry fuel for heating as well as food for sustenance. Through all these adaptations, the fundamental character of the Janissary Corps remained constant. They were disciplined, professional soldiers who combined individual skill with collective effectiveness. They were scholars as well as warriors, capable of learning and adapting while maintaining their essential identity as the elite force of the Ottoman Empire. As decades passed and the empire reached the peak of its territorial expansion, the Janissaries found themselves defending borders that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Yemen, from the Crimean steppes to the mountains of Ethiopia. They had become not just soldiers, but the guardians of a civilization, men whose individual stories had been subsumed into something larger and more enduring than any of them could have imagined as frightened children being led away from their village homes. The weight of this responsibility was both burden and honor. Every Janissary understood that he carried with him the reputation of the corps, the expectations of the Sultan, and the hopes of an empire that had grown to encompass millions of people speaking dozens of languages and following countless local customs. When they appeared on a battlefield, they weren't just representing themselves or even their immediate comrades. They were the visible embodiment of Ottoman power, the sharp edge of an imperial system that had transformed the political landscape of 3 continents. But empires, like men, contain within themselves the seeds of their own transformation. As the Janissaries reached the height of their military effectiveness, forces were already at work that would eventually challenge not just their dominance on the battlefield, but their very reason for existence. The world was changing around them, and even the most adaptable military force in history would eventually have to confront the limits of its ability to evolve. Tomorrow night, we'll witness these legendary warriors at the pinnacle of their power, standing before the walls of Vienna as the high tide of Ottoman expansion crashes against the defenses of Christian Europe. We'll see them as they never saw themselves, through the eyes of their enemies and allies, as figures of both terror and admiration, whose very presence could alter the course of history, and will begin to understand how the very qualities that made them invincible would eventually contribute to their downfall. As the empire they had helped to build began the long, slow process of transformation that would ultimately leave no place for warrior slaves in a changing world. But tonight, in the flickering light of oil lamps in barracks that have long since crumbled to dust, we can imagine these remarkable men preparing for whatever campaign awaited them, confident in their skills, devoted to their brotherhood, and utterly convinced that they served a cause greater than themselves. They were the last of their kind, the final flowering of a military tradition that had shaped the medieval world, and their story was far from over. The siege of Vienna in 1683 would become the defining moment that revealed both the supreme confidence of the Janissary system and the first cracks in what had seemed an invincible military machine. As the massive Ottoman army assembled outside the city walls that summer, the Janissaries represented not just military might, but the culmination of 3 centuries of systematic warfare that had reshaped the known world. Picture the scene as nearly 20,000 Janissaries took their positions in the siege lines. Their white caps gleamed in the morning sun like a field of deadly flowers. Their artillery, the finest bronze cannons in the world, were wheeled into position with the mechanical precision that had become their trademark. Behind them stretched supply trains that seemed to extend to the horizon, carrying everything needed to reduce the most important fortress in Central Europe. But something was different this time. The Europe they faced was no longer the collection of fractured kingdoms that had fallen so easily to earlier Ottoman campaigns. Military technology was evolving rapidly. The balance of power that had favored disciplined infantry with muskets was shifting toward more mobile artillery and cavalry tactics. Most importantly, the political unity that the Janissaries had exploited for centuries was giving way to unprecedented cooperation among Christian powers. The siege itself unfolded with the methodical precision that characterized all Janissary operations. Their engineers began the careful work of positioning artillery and digging approach trenches. Their miners started the dangerous task of tunneling beneath the city's massive walls. Their infantry established the tight blockade that would starve the defenders into submission if direct assault failed. For weeks, the siege proceeded according to the established Ottoman playbook. The great cannons thundered day and night, sending stone balls crashing into medieval walls that had never been designed to withstand such punishment. Sections of fortification crumbled under the relentless bombardment. Breach after breach opened in defences that had protected Vienna for centuries. Inside the city, the defenders watched with growing desperation as their walls disintegrated around them. They had heard stories of Ottoman sieges, knew what happened to cities that resisted too long. The systematic destruction of their fortifications seemed to confirm that Vienna would soon join the long list of Christian strongholds that had fallen to the Sultan's armies. But the Janissaries, for all their skill and experience, were fighting a different kind of war than they realized. The political landscape of Europe had shifted dramatically during the decades of Ottoman expansion. What had once been a collection of competing kingdoms more interested in fighting each other than confronting the Ottoman threat had evolved into something approaching a true alliance. The relief army that finally appeared on the hills overlooking Vienna was unlike anything the Janissaries had faced in previous campaigns. Polish heavy cavalry, Austrian infantry, and German artillery had been coordinated by commanders who understood Ottoman tactics and had developed specific countermeasures. This wasn't another feudal levy thrown together at the last moment. It was a professional force that had been trained and equipped specifically to break Ottoman military power. When the battle finally came, it arrived with a sudden violence that caught even veteran Janissaries by surprise. The Polish winged hussars, their distinctive feathered armour glittering in the afternoon sun, struck the Ottoman lines with an impact that seemed to shake the earth itself. These weren't the disorganized cavalry charges that Janissary formations had been breaking for centuries. This was coordinated assault by men who understood exactly what they were attempting. The disciplined ranks that had held firm against so many enemies began to waver under pressure they had never experienced. The careful formations that had dominated European battlefields for generations found themselves overwhelmed by tactics specifically designed to exploit their weaknesses. For the first time in their history, significant numbers of Janissaries broke and ran from a battlefield. The defeat at Vienna was more than just a military reverse. It was a psychological shock that reverberated throughout the Ottoman Empire. The Janissaries, who had seemed invincible for 3 centuries, had been decisively beaten by an enemy they had always regarded as inferior. The myth of Ottoman military supremacy, carefully cultivated through generations of victory, had been shattered in a single afternoon. But perhaps more importantly, the siege revealed fundamental problems within the Ottoman system that went far beyond tactical considerations. The empire had grown so vast that effective communication between the capital and frontier armies had become nearly impossible. The political unity that had characterized earlier periods was fragmenting, as different factions within the government pursued conflicting objectives. The Janissary corps itself was changing in ways that undermined its traditional effectiveness. The strict recruitment system that had created such disciplined soldiers was being corrupted by political influence and economic pressures. Sons of existing Janissaries were being admitted to the corps. violating the principle that had made the Devshirme system so effective. Local recruits were being accepted to fill shortages, bringing with them loyalties and attitudes that conflicted with traditional Janissary values. The celibacy requirements that had kept Janissaries focused entirely on their military duties were being relaxed or ignored. Many were now married with families, creating divided loyalties that affected their willingness to embark on long campaigns. The communal life that had forged such strong bonds between warriors was being undermined by individual interests and concerns. Economic changes within the empire were also affecting the core in profound ways. The regular pay that had been one of the great advantages of Janissary service was becoming irregular as imperial finances grew strained. Inflation was eroding the value of their salaries. The social status that had once made Janissary service attractive was declining as other paths to advancement opened within the expanding bureaucracy. These internal problems were compounded by changes in military technology that challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare. The disciplined infantry formations that had been the Janissaries' greatest strength were becoming vulnerable to new artillery techniques. The muskets that had given them such advantages were being superseded by more effective firearms. Most critically, the siege warfare at which they had excelled was being revolutionized by advances in fortification design. The new Trace Italienne fortifications that were spreading across Europe were specifically designed to counter the kind of artillery-based siege techniques that the Ottomans had perfected. These star-shaped forts with their angled walls and overlapping fields of fire made traditional siege approaches extremely costly. The mathematical precision that characterized their design required different kinds of expertise than even the most skilled Janissary engineers possessed. European military thinking was evolving in other ways that challenged Ottoman advantages. The professional officer corps that were emerging in various European armies brought systematic study to military problems in ways that paralleled but ultimately surpassed Ottoman methods. Military academies were producing commanders who understood both the theoretical principles of warfare and the practical challenges of implementing new tactics. The scientific revolution that was transforming European intellectual life was also affecting military technology. Advances in metallurgy were producing better cannons and small arms. Improvements in mathematics were leading to more accurate artillery. New understanding of chemistry was revolutionizing the production of gunpowder and explosives. But perhaps most fundamentally, the entire social and economic basis of the Ottoman military system was being challenged by changes in how European societies organized themselves for war. The feudal levies that had been so vulnerable to disciplined Ottoman infantry were giving way to professional standing armies that could match Janissary discipline while surpassing their flexibility. The financial systems that supported these new armies were also more sophisticated than what the Ottoman Empire could manage. European governments were learning to use debt financing and taxation methods that could sustain military expenditures far beyond what traditional imperial systems could support. The merchant classes that were driving European economic growth had interests that aligned with military expansion in ways that created powerful political coalitions. These changes didn't happen overnight, and they didn't immediately negate all Ottoman military advantages. The Janissaries continued to win battles and capture territory for decades after Vienna, but the trajectory was clear to anyone willing to see it. The military system that had dominated the medieval world was being superseded by approaches better suited to the emerging modern era. Within the Janissary corps itself, thoughtful men were beginning to recognize that their world was changing. Veterans who had fought in the great campaigns of the 16th century could see that the young recruits joining their ranks lacked the dedication and discipline that had characterized earlier generations. The rigorous training that had once distinguished Janissary preparation was being shortened and simplified to accommodate larger numbers and political pressures. The intellectual life that had flourished within the barracks was also declining. The libraries that had once housed thousands of volumes in multiple languages were being neglected as fewer Janissaries possessed the literacy skills to use them effectively. The scholarly discussions that had been such an important part of their culture were being replaced by more mundane concerns about pay, promotion, and personal advancement. The religious devotion that had provided spiritual foundation for their military service was becoming more perfunctory and less meaningful. The mystical practices that had helped previous generations find meaning in their difficult lives were being abandoned as the core became more secular and materialistic. The sense of divine mission that had sustained them through countless hardships was eroding as their role within the empire became more political and less spiritual. These internal changes were reflected in their military performance. The discipline that had once been their defining characteristic was becoming less reliable. Units would sometimes refuse orders they considered unreasonable or dangerous. The coordination between different elements of the corps was deteriorating as local commanders pursued their own objectives rather than following centralized plans. The technological adaptation that had once been their great strength was also declining. New weapons and tactics were being adopted slowly and reluctantly. The innovative spirit that had made them pioneers in firearms and artillery was giving way to conservative adherence to traditional methods that were becoming increasingly obsolete. Most critically, the loyalty that had been the foundation of their effectiveness was being compromised by political involvement that had been forbidden in earlier periods. Janissary units were beginning to take sides in court politics, supporting particular factions or individuals rather than maintaining their traditional devotion to the Sultan as an institution. This political activity created divisions within the corps that undermined their unity and effectiveness. The economic activities that many Janissaries were pursuing to supplement their irregular pay were also affecting their military readiness. Men who had once devoted themselves entirely to martial pursuits were now involved in trade, crafts, and other civilian occupations that competed with their military duties for time and attention. The barracks that had once been exclusively military spaces were becoming mixed communities where commercial activities interfered with training and discipline. But perhaps most significantly, the recruitment system that had created such effective warriors was breaking down completely. The Devshirme, which had provided a steady supply of young men completely devoted to imperial service, was being abandoned in favor of voluntary enrollment that attracted very different kinds of people. Men were joining the Janissaries not out of dedication to the empire, but for personal advancement or economic security. These voluntary recruits brought with them family connections, local loyalties, and personal agendas that conflicted with traditional Janissary values. They were less willing to accept the harsh discipline and dangerous assignments that had been routine for earlier generations. Their commitment to the collective good of the corps was weaker than their concern for individual welfare. The training system that had once produced such remarkable soldiers was also deteriorating. The long years of agricultural service that had built physical strength and cultural integration were being shortened or eliminated entirely. The scholarly education that had made Janissaries effective administrators and diplomats was being reduced to basic literacy. The spiritual formation that had given them psychological resilience was being neglected as unnecessary in a more secular age. As these changes accumulated over decades, the Janissary Corps gradually transformed from the elite military force that had terrorized Europe into something quite different. They retained their distinctive uniforms and many of their traditional privileges, but they were becoming more of a political interest group than a military organization. Their primary concerns were increasingly focused on protecting their economic position and political influence rather than serving the military needs of the empire. This transformation was gradual enough that it wasn't immediately obvious to outside observers. European intelligence reports continue to describe the Janissaries as a formidable military force, long after their actual effectiveness had seriously declined. But within the Ottoman Empire, perceptive officials were beginning to recognize that fundamental reforms would be necessary if the empire was to maintain its military competitiveness. The problem was that any serious reform of the Janissary system would require confronting powerful political and economic interests that had grown up around the existing arrangements. the corps had become so entrenched in Ottoman society that changing it would require transforming the entire imperial system. Such changes would inevitably provoke resistance from those who benefited from current arrangements. As the 17th century drew to a close, the Ottoman Empire found itself in an increasingly difficult position. Its traditional military advantages were eroding, while its enemies were growing stronger and more sophisticated. The Janissary Corps that had once been its greatest asset was becoming a liability that consumed resources while providing diminishing returns in military effectiveness. The story of the Janissaries was entering its final phase, though few could see it at the time. The boys who had been taken from Christian villages and transformed into the most feared warriors of their age had created something remarkable. But like all human institutions, their creation contained within itself the seeds of its own transformation and ultimate dissolution. Tomorrow night, we'll witness the final act of this extraordinary drama as the Ottoman Empire struggled to adapt to a changing world, while the Janissaries fought desperately to preserve their place within it. We'll see how their very success had planted the seeds of their downfall, and how the system that had created such effective soldiers ultimately proved incapable of reforming itself to meet new challenges. The end, when it came, would be as dramatic and violent as anything in their long history of warfare. But tonight, we can reflect on what they had achieved during that human beings could be shaped by institutions their centuries of dominance. They had proven in ways that seemed almost miraculous. They had demonstrated that loyalty, discipline, and shared purpose could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Most importantly, they had shown that even the most unlikely people, given the right training and motivation, could accomplish extraordinary things. The frightened children who had been torn from their families had grown into men who commanded the respect of emperors and the fear of nations. They had built something that lasted for centuries and influenced the development of military institutions around the world. Their story was ending, but their legacy would endure long after their distinctive white caps had disappeared from the battlefields of Europe and Asia. The end began not with a single dramatic battle, but with decades of slow transformation that few recognized until it was too late. By the early 18th century, the Janissary barracks that had once hummed with the sounds of weapons training and scholarly debate had become something entirely different. The rhythmic clash of steel on steel was replaced by the quieter sounds of commerce and political intrigue. Men who should have been perfecting their marksmanship were instead negotiating trade deals or plotting their advancement through the increasingly complex web of imperial politics. Walk through those same barracks now, and you would see a world that the original Devshirme boys could never have imagined. The great training yards where generations had mastered the art of coordinated musket volleys were cluttered with workshops and market stalls. Janissaries, who should have been studying military treatises, were instead keeping ledger books for their private businesses. The communal kitchens that had once symbolized their unity were now serving men whose primary loyalty was to their own economic interests, rather than to the brotherhood that had sustained their predecessors. The corruption hadn't happened overnight. It had crept in like water through cracks in a dam, each small compromise making the next one easier to justify. When Janissaries were first allowed to marry, it seemed like a reasonable accommodation to changing times. When they were permitted to engage in trade to supplement their irregular pay, it appeared to be a practical solution to financial problems. When recruitment began to favor connections over merit, it looked like efficient use of existing relationships, but each of these changes weakened the bonds that had held the system together. Married Janissaries were less willing to embark on dangerous campaigns that might leave their families without support. Those engaged in commerce had divided attention between their military duties and their business interests. Men who had bought their way into the corps lacked the dedication that had characterized those selected through the rigorous Devshirme process. The discipline that had once been their defining characteristic was eroding in ways both subtle and obvious. Units would debate orders rather than executing them immediately. Individual Janissaries would pursue personal vendettas that interfered with military objectives. Most troubling of all, the corps was beginning to fragment along political lines, with different units supporting different factions within the imperial government. The physical deterioration was equally evident to anyone willing to see it. The weapons that had once been maintained with obsessive care were often in poor condition. The uniforms that had once been sources of pride were frequently dirty and ill-fitting. The formations that had once moved with mechanical precision now shuffled across training grounds with obvious reluctance. Even their legendary marksmanship was declining. Young Janissaries spent less time at the firing ranges and more time in coffeehouses, discussing politics or business opportunities. When they did practice, their focus was often divided by concerns that had nothing to do with military effectiveness. Veterans who tried to maintain traditional standards found themselves increasingly isolated and ignored. The intellectual life that had once flourished within the corps was also withering. The libraries that had been centers of learning were neglected as fewer Janissaries possessed the education necessary to use them effectively. The scholarly discussions that had been such an important part of their culture were being replaced by gossip about political developments and commercial opportunities. The religious devotion that had provided spiritual foundation for their military service was becoming increasingly hollow. Prayers were recited mechanically without the deep conviction that had sustained earlier generations. The mystical practices that had helped men find meaning in their difficult lives were abandoned as the corps became more materialistic and less spiritual. But perhaps most damaging of all was the loss of the sense of mission that had made their sacrifices meaningful. Previous generations of Janissaries had seen themselves as instruments of divine will, expanding the realm of Islam and bringing order to chaotic frontiers. The men of the 18th century increasingly saw themselves as employees of a failing bureaucracy, expected to risk their lives for causes they neither understood nor particularly supported. The Ottoman government was not blind to these problems, but every attempt at reform ran into the same fundamental obstacle. The Janissaries had become too powerful politically to be easily controlled. They were no longer just soldiers who followed orders. They were a political force with their own interests and agenda, capable of deposing sultans who threatened their privileges. Their involvement in palace politics created a vicious cycle that made effective reform increasingly difficult. Sultans who tried to restore discipline found themselves facing revolts that could topple their governments. Those who accommodated Janissary demands found that each concession led to new demands that further undermined imperial authority. The corps that had once been the ultimate instrument of sultanic power had become a constraint on that power. The irony was not lost on thoughtful observers within the empire. The very success of the Janissary system had created the conditions for its own destruction. By making these soldiers so effective and so essential, the Ottomans had given them leverage that they eventually used to protect their own interests rather than serve imperial needs. European military observers, meanwhile, were watching these developments with great interest. Intelligence reports from Ottoman territories described in detail the declining effectiveness of Janissary units and the growing political instability within the empire. European commanders began to plan their campaigns based on the assumption that Ottoman military power was no longer what it had once been. The technological gap that had been gradually widening was now becoming decisive. European armies were equipped with standardized firearms manufactured in modern factories, while many Janissaries still carried weapons that had been crafted by individual artisans decades earlier. European artillery was becoming more mobile and accurate, while Ottoman cannons remained largely unchanged from the designs that had been effective in the 16th century. More fundamentally, European military organization was evolving in ways that made traditional Ottoman advantages irrelevant. The disciplined infantry formations that had been the Janissaries' great strength were being superseded by more flexible tactics that emphasized individual initiative and rapid response to changing conditions. The siege warfare at which they had excelled was being revolutionized by new fortification designs that made traditional approaches obsolete. The social and economic changes sweeping through Europe were also creating military capabilities that the Ottoman Empire could not match. The commercial revolution was generating wealth that could support larger and better equipped armies. The scientific revolution was producing innovations in metallurgy, chemistry, and mathematics that had direct military applications. The political changes that were creating more centralized nation-states were enabling more effective coordination of military resources. But perhaps most importantly, European societies were developing military institutions that could adapt to change more effectively than the rigid Ottoman system. Professional officer corps trained in military academies could incorporate new tactics and technologies more quickly than traditionalist Janissary commanders. Standardized training programs could produce soldiers with consistent skills more efficiently than the individualized apprenticeship system that had characterized Janissary education. The financial systems that supported these new military capabilities were also more sophisticated than what the Ottoman Empire could manage. European governments were learning to use taxation and debt financing in ways that could sustain military expenditures far beyond traditional levels. The merchant classes that were driving economic growth had interests that aligned with military expansion, creating political support for the investments necessary to maintain military superiority. Within the Ottoman Empire, a few perceptive officials recognized that fundamental changes would be necessary if the empire was to survive in this new environment. They understood that the Janissary system, whatever its past glories, had become an obstacle to the kind of military modernization that changing circumstances required. But they also understood that any serious reform would provoke massive resistance from entrenched interests. The Janissaries themselves were not entirely unaware of these developments. Many could see that their military effectiveness was declining and that their political position, while still strong, was not as secure as it had once been. But their response to these challenges was to cling more tightly to their traditional privileges rather than adapt to new circumstances. They resisted attempts to modernize their training, seeing such changes as threats to their established ways of doing things. They opposed the introduction of new weapons and tactics, preferring familiar methods, even when those methods were becoming obsolete. Most critically, they used their political influence to block reforms that might have restored their military effectiveness, but would have required them to give up some of their economic and social privileges. This resistance to change created a self-reinforcing cycle of decline. As their military effectiveness decreased, their political value to the imperial government also decreased. But rather than accepting necessary reforms, they used what political influence they retained to protect their immediate interests. This short-sighted approach accelerated their decline, while making eventual dramatic change more likely. The sultans who ruled during this period found themselves in an impossible position. They needed effective military forces to maintain the empire against increasingly dangerous external threats. But the Janissaries, who should have provided those forces, were instead consuming resources while providing diminishing military value. Any attempt to reform the system risked provoking internal conflicts that could be as dangerous as external enemies. Some tried gradual reform, introducing small changes that they hoped would eventually accumulate into meaningful transformation. Others attempted more dramatic interventions, trying to impose new systems while working around Janissary resistance. Still others simply tried to manage the decline as gracefully as possible, while hoping that external circumstances would improve. None of these approaches proved successful because they all failed to address the fundamental problem. The Janissary system had been designed for a different world, one in which disciplined infantry with muskets could dominate battlefields, and systematic siege warfare could reduce any fortification. That world was disappearing, but the system itself could not adapt, because adaptation would require abandoning the very characteristics that had made it successful. The men who filled Janissary ranks during this period were caught between incompatible pressures. They were expected to maintain the military traditions that had made their predecessors legendary, but they were also expected to function within a political and economic environment that made those traditions increasingly meaningless. Many responded by focusing on the aspects of their role that still provided tangible benefits while neglecting those that had become burdensome. The result was a military organization that retained the outward forms of its historic greatness, while losing the substance that had made those forms meaningful. Janissaries still wore their distinctive uniforms and carried their traditional weapons, but they no longer possessed the skills, discipline, or dedication that had made those symbols of terror to their enemies. The barracks that had once been centers of military excellence became political clubs where men plotted advancement and discussed business opportunities. The training grounds that had witnessed the perfection of military techniques were used for ceremonial parades that impressed civilians but had little connection to actual combat effectiveness. The workshops that had once produced superior weapons and equipment were converted to commercial enterprises that served private interests rather than military needs. Even their religious observances, which had once provided spiritual foundation for their military service, became routine performances that satisfied social expectations without inspiring genuine devotion. The prayers that had once prepared men for the possibility of death in battle now seemed more concerned with requesting divine assistance for commercial ventures or political schemes. The transformation was so gradual that many within the corps failed to recognize how completely their organization had changed. Veterans who remembered earlier times often assumed that temporary problems would eventually be resolved and that traditional effectiveness would be restored. Younger members who had never experienced the corps at its peak accepted current conditions as normal and saw no reason for dramatic change. But outside observers, both within the empire and in foreign countries, could see clearly that the Janissaries were no longer the military force they had once been. Intelligence reports described units that were more interested in protecting their economic privileges than in preparing for war. Diplomatic correspondents discussed the possibility that Ottoman military power might be more vulnerable than it appeared. The European powers that had once trembled at the mention of Janissary armies began to calculate whether the time had come to test Ottoman defenses more aggressively. Military planners who had spent decades developing strategies to counter Ottoman advantages started to consider whether those advantages still existed. Diplomatic negotiations that had once been conducted with careful deference to Ottoman power became more assertive as European confidence grew. The spiral of decline was accelerating, but it was still not obvious to everyone involved that fundamental change was inevitable. The Ottoman Empire remained vast and wealthy, with resources that could theoretically support military modernization if they could be properly mobilized. The Janissaries still retained many of their traditional skills, even if their discipline and motivation had deteriorated. Most importantly, no external enemy had yet demonstrated conclusively that Ottoman military power was no longer formidable. But the foundations of the system were cracking in ways that would soon make dramatic change unavoidable. The political tensions between the imperial government and the Janissary Corps were approaching levels that could not be sustained indefinitely. The economic pressures created by military inefficiency and external threats were mounting beyond what traditional methods could address. Most critically, the technological and organizational gap between Ottoman and European military capabilities was widening to the point where it could no longer be ignored. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine whether the Ottoman Empire could adapt to the modern world or would be relegated to the margins of international affairs. The Janissaries, who had once been the instruments of Ottoman expansion, were about to become the focal point of a struggle that would determine the empire's survival. The men who walked through the barracks each evening, sharing their communal meals and discussing the events of the day, had no way of knowing that they were living through the final chapters of one of history's most remarkable military institutions. They could see that things were changing, But they could not foresee how rapidly and dramatically those changes would accelerate. Some still believed that reforms could restore their effectiveness without requiring fundamental alterations to their way of life. Others hoped that external circumstances would improve in ways that would reduce pressure for change. Still others simply focused on their immediate concerns, trusting that solutions would emerge from somewhere else within the imperial system. But the forces that would soon sweep away their world were already gathering momentum. The sultans who would have the courage to confront them directly were already being born. The European powers that would take advantage of Ottoman weakness were already planning their moves. The technologies that would make traditional military methods obsolete were already being developed. The Janissaries had created something extraordinary, a military system that had dominated the medieval world and shaped the development of 3 continents. But they had also created something that could not adapt to the modern world that was emerging around them. The very perfection of their system had made it rigid and inflexible, unable to respond to challenges that required fundamental rather than incremental change. As the 18th century progressed toward its climactic final decades, the question was no longer whether the Janissary system would survive. The question was how its end would come, and what would replace it in the new world that was being born through the collision of traditional empires with modern military and political systems. The boys who had been taken from Christian villages centuries earlier had grown into men who had conquered much of the known world. Now their successors would have to decide whether they could find the courage to transform themselves one final time, or whether they would cling to the past until it dragged them down with it. The answer would come soon enough, and when it did, it would be as dramatic and final as anything in their long history of warfare and transformation. The reckoning came not with the clash of armies, but with the scratch of a pen and the whisper of silk curtains in palace chambers. In the early hours of June 15th, 1826, Sultan Mahmud II sat in his private study, surrounded by documents that would reshape an empire. The oil lamps flickered against the darkness, casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of imperial power. But this night would be different. This night, the Sultan would sign the death warrant of the most famous military force in history. The decision hadn't been made lightly or quickly. For months, Mahmud had been quietly building support among palace officials, religious leaders, and military commanders who understood that the empire stood at a crossroads. The Janissaries, once the sharp edge of Ottoman expansion, had become a cancer eating away at the state's ability to defend itself. They consumed enormous resources while providing little military value. They interfered in politics while neglecting their duties. Most critically, they blocked every attempt at modernization that might have saved the empire from the military irrelevance that threatened its very survival. The proximate cause of the final confrontation was Mahmud's announcement of military reforms that would create a new army trained in European methods. The Nizam-ı Cedid, or New Order, would be equipped with modern weapons, trained in contemporary tactics, and organized according to principles that European armies had proven effective. It would be professional, disciplined, and loyal to the Sultan rather than to its own corporate interests. The Janissaries' response was predictable. They overturned their great cooking cauldrons in the traditional gesture of revolt, just as their predecessors had done countless times when imperial policy threatened their privileges. But this time, something was different. This time, the Sultan was ready for them. Mahmud had spent years preparing for this moment. He had quietly secured the loyalty of other military units, particularly the artillery corps that controlled the cannons positioned around Istanbul. He had built alliances with religious authorities who could provide theological justification for his actions. Most importantly, he had convinced key palace officials that the survival of the empire required the destruction of the institution that had once been its greatest strength. When the Janissaries gathered in the Hippodrome to demand the abandonment of military reforms, they found themselves facing not a frightened sultan willing to negotiate, but an implacable enemy determined to end their power forever. The artillery pieces that ringed the ancient arena were loaded with grapeshot and manned by gunners whose loyalty to the Sultan was absolute. The religious authorities had declared the revolt to be against Islamic law, removing any claim the Janissaries might have had to divine sanction for their actions. The battle, when it came, was shockingly brief and completely one-sided. The men who had once terrorized Europe with their disciplined volleys found themselves trapped in an enclosed space, facing artillery fire from multiple directions with no possibility of escape. The great square that had once hosted chariot races became a killing ground where centuries of military tradition died in clouds of smoke and the screams of the wounded. Those Janissaries who were not killed in the initial bombardment were hunted through the streets of Istanbul by loyal troops and civilian mobs that had been encouraged to settle old scores. The barracks that had been centers of their power were burned to the ground, their libraries destroyed, their workshops demolished. Even the distinctive white caps that had been symbols of their identity were banned from public display. The slaughter continued for days as Mahmud's forces systematically eliminated not just active Janissaries, but anyone associated with the corps. Estimates of the dead ranged from thousands to tens of thousands, but precise numbers were impossible to determine because the government wanted to erase all traces of the institution's existence. Former Janissaries who survived did so by fleeing the capital or completely abandoning their former identities. The psychological impact of this destruction was perhaps even more significant than its immediate military effects. An institution that had seemed permanent and unchangeable had been wiped out in a matter of days. The men who had considered themselves the guardians of Ottoman tradition had been branded as traitors to the empire they claimed to serve. The system that had created the most effective military force of the medieval world had been revealed as an obstacle to survival in the modern era. But the elimination of the Janissaries was only the beginning of Mahmud's transformation of the Ottoman military system. He immediately began creating new units trained by European instructors and equipped with the latest weapons. These soldiers wore uniforms modeled on European patterns, drilled according to contemporary manuals, and learned tactics that emphasized flexibility and adaptation rather than rigid adherence to traditional methods. The new army that emerged from these reforms was fundamentally different from what had come before. Instead of being recruited through the Devshirme System that had torn children from their families, it drew volunteers from across the empire who served for fixed terms before returning to civilian life. Instead of living in closed barracks communities that developed their own culture and loyalties, soldiers were integrated into the broader society and maintained connections with their original communities. The training they received emphasized technical competence rather than spiritual formation. They learned to operate modern artillery, use contemporary small arms, and execute maneuvers that European armies had proven effective. But they were not expected to be scholar warriors or mystical brothers bound together by shared hardship. They were professional soldiers whose primary loyalty was to the state rather than to each other. The change represented more than just military modernization. It reflected a fundamental shift in how the Ottoman Empire understood its place in the world. The Janissary system had been based on the assumption that Ottoman methods were superior to those of their enemies, and that success depended on perfecting traditional approaches. The new system acknowledged that other societies had developed superior methods that needed to be adopted if the empire was to survive. This intellectual humility was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Mahmud's reforms. For centuries, Ottoman success had bred a confidence that their way of doing things was inherently superior. The destruction of the Janissaries represented an admission that this assumption was no longer tenable, that survival required learning from enemies who had surpassed Ottoman capabilities. The European powers that had long feared Ottoman military might watch these developments with great interest. Intelligence reports described the systematic elimination of the Janissary Corps and the creation of new military units that might eventually pose renewed threats to European interests. But there was also recognition that the Ottoman Empire was entering a period of weakness and uncertainty that might create new opportunities for European expansion. The process of military modernization would take decades to complete and would never fully restore Ottoman power to its former levels. The technological and organizational gap that had opened between the empire and its European rivals was too large to be closed quickly, and the political instability created by such dramatic changes made sustained reform efforts difficult to maintain. But the elimination of the Janissaries did achieve Mahmud's immediate objective of removing the primary obstacle to military modernization. The new army that replaced them was more flexible, more adaptable, and more capable of incorporating innovations that might improve its effectiveness. Most importantly, it was loyal to the imperial government rather than to its own corporate interests. The human cost of this transformation was enormous. Thousands of men who had devoted their lives to military service were killed or forced to flee. Families were destroyed. Communities that had grown up around the barracks were scattered. Centuries of military tradition and accumulated knowledge were lost forever. The cultural impact was equally significant. The Janissary Corps had been more than just a military organization. It had been a distinctive way of life that had no parallel in other societies. The men who had been shaped by the Devshirme System had created a unique culture that blended military discipline with scholarly achievement, religious devotion with professional competence. When that culture was destroyed, something irreplaceable was lost. But from the perspective of Ottoman survival, these costs were necessary prices for adaptation to a changing world. The empire that emerged from Mahmud's reforms was different from what had come before, but it was also more capable of functioning in an international system dominated by European power and technological innovation. The boys who had once been taken from Christian villages to become the most feared warriors of their age were gone forever. Their distinctive white caps would never again appear on battlefields across 3 continents. Their disciplined formations would never again strike terror into the hearts of European armies. The barracks where they had lived as brothers were reduced to rubble and ash, but their legacy lived on in ways both obvious and subtle. The military institutions that replaced them incorporated lessons learned through centuries of Janissary experience. The tactical innovations they had pioneered continued to influence military thinking. Most importantly, their story remained as a reminder of what human beings could achieve when properly motivated and trained, and of how even the most successful institutions must adapt or perish when the world changes around them. The empire they had helped to build would continue for another century, gradually modernizing its military and administrative systems while struggling to maintain its independence in an increasingly competitive international environment. The sultans who ruled after Mahmud would face new challenges that required different solutions, but they would do so with the knowledge that even the most cherished traditions could be sacrificed when survival was at stake. The Janissaries had begun as an experiment in human transformation, taking Christian children and turning them into Muslim warriors through systematic training and cultural conditioning. They ended as a lesson in institutional evolution, demonstrating that organizations that cannot adapt to changing circumstances will eventually be swept away by those that can. Their story was over, but the questions it raised about loyalty, identity, military effectiveness, and social change would continue to resonate through the centuries that followed. In the flickering candlelight of history, they remained what they had always been, a reminder that human potential is limitless, but human institutions are not. The last echoes of their war drums had faded into silence. The great cauldrons that had symbolized their unity lay cold and abandoned. The boys who had once been torn from their families to serve an empire were finally at rest. But their legend would endure, whispered in the shadows of a world that would never again see their like. The silence that followed the destruction of 1826 was not the end of their story, but but its transformation into something else entirely. In the decades that came after, as the Ottoman Empire struggled through its final century of existence, the ghost of the Janissaries haunted every attempt at military reform. European observers who had once written fearfully of these disciplined warriors now penned analytical reports about an empire trying desperately to modernize itself before it was too late. The new armies that Sultan Mahmud created in their place were technically superior in many ways. They carried rifles instead of muskets, wore uniforms cut in the latest European fashion, and drilled according to manuals translated from French and German military texts. But they lacked something indefinable that the Janissaries had possessed, that sense of absolute commitment that came from having no other identity, no other loyalty, no other purpose than service to the empire. These modern soldiers serve for fixed terms and then return to civilian life. They maintained connections with their families and communities. They thought of military service as a job rather than a calling. In many ways, this was healthier and more humane than the system that had created the Janissaries. But it also meant that the Ottoman Empire never again possessed a military force with the single-minded dedication that had once made its armies nearly invincible. The barracks that rose from the ashes of the old Janissary compounds were built according to modern principles of hygiene and efficiency. They had proper ventilation, separate sleeping quarters, and facilities that would have amazed the warriors of earlier centuries. But they were also sterile in ways that the old barracks had never been. There were no libraries filled with books in a dozen languages, no workshops where soldiers crafted works of art in their spare time, no coffee houses where veterans shared the accumulated wisdom of generations. The men who lived in these new barracks were soldiers, nothing more and nothing less. They were not expected to be scholars or craftsmen or mystics. They learned to march in formation and fire their weapons accurately, but they did not spend years mastering the complex cultural knowledge that had made their predecessors effective in so many different situations. The Ottoman military had gained efficiency but lost something harder to define. European military observers noted these changes with professional interest. The Ottoman Empire was clearly trying to modernize its forces, but the results were mixed at best. The new soldiers were better equipped and more conventionally trained than the Janissaries had been in their final decades. But they lacked the esprit de corps and institutional memory that had made Ottoman armies formidable for so long. More fundamentally, the destruction of the Janissaries had severed the connection between the Ottoman military and the unique social system that had created such effective warriors. The Devshirme was gone forever, and with it the possibility of creating soldiers whose entire identity was bound up with service to the empire. Future Ottoman armies would have to find other sources of motivation and cohesion. The challenge proved more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Military effectiveness depends not just on equipment and training, but on the intangible factors that make men willing to die for a cause. The Janissaries had possessed this willingness because they had been shaped from childhood to see themselves as servants of a divine mission. Their successors, recruited through conventional methods and trained in European techniques, never developed the same level of commitment. And so we reached the end of our journey through the shadowed halls and smoky barracks, where history's most remarkable warriors once lived and died. The Janissaries, those boys stolen from Christian villages and forged into the empire's steel edge, remind us that human transformation is possible but impermanent. Their white caps have vanished from battlefields. Their cauldrons lie cold. Yet their story whispers across centuries, teaching us that even the mightiest institutions must adapt or fade into the endless silent dust of time.